You can't even cook properly. Bring me my food now. Arlo stormed into the kitchen, his brow furrowed as he took in the sight of unfinished dishes. You're driving Mom crazy with your carelessness, he added, his voice sharp with irritation. At that moment, a stack of plates wobbled on the edge of the table before crashing to the floor, shards scattering in every direction. Arlo barely flinched. His expression remained eerily calm. This is your fault. You shouldn't have stacked them like that, he declared before turning on his heel and walking out of the kitchen without another word. The sound of breaking dishes must have reached the other room because my father-in-law rushed in. Are you okay? He asked, concern lacing his voice. His eyes met mine, and he hesitated, his expression shifting as if he had just noticed something he hadn't seen before. I'm going to talk to my wife about this. You should come too, he said, his voice quiet but firm. There was something in his tone, something unfamiliar, that sent a chill down my spine. My name is Helen Davis, and I am 32 years old. I've been married to Arlo for almost a year. Before we tied the knot, I worked as an outpatient nurse at a small pediatric clinic. Wanting to expand my skills, I recently transferred to a general hospital in the same city. 1 year of marriage still feels like the honeymoon phase, or at least it should. But from the moment we said our vows, we have lived with my mother-in-law. Arlo insisted we move in with her, worried she'd be lonely since his father worked out of town. At first, I thought it wouldn't be so bad. I imagined we'd support each other, share responsibilities, and build a sense of family. I was wrong. Helen, you are terrible. Tiana's sharp voice cut through the air the morning after my first night shift at the new hospital. I had worked from midnight to 8:30 a.m. A grueling schedule I wasn't yet accustomed to. Exhausted and dizzy, I stumbled home, hoping for rest, only to be met with her fury. It was barely 9 a.m., and my husband was already at work. Our neighbors were probably passing by outside. But that didn't stop Tiana from raising her voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. You didn't even make me breakfast. What were you thinking? She snapped. What? I blinked, struggling to process her words. I made breakfast last night before going to work. Did Arlo eat it all? Even after explaining, she didn't stop. I rubbed my eyes, willing myself to stay awake, and reluctantly made breakfast for her again. She took a single bite and scowled. It's too salty. I swallowed my frustration, turned to leave, and finally, headed for the bedroom. But before I could escape, her voice stopped me. Hey, Helen, where do you think you're going? There are dishes to clean up, she demanded. I turned back, my exhaustion making my temper brittle. I just finished my shift. Tiana, can you wash them? She scoffed. Cleaning up is part of cooking, isn't it? I left the laundry for you too. If you're going to take a break, at least finish your chores first. I opened my mouth to argue, but I already knew how this would go. You're Arlo's wife, right? She added, her tone turning syrupy but no less condescending. And you don't even have a child keeping you busy. So, I clenched my jaw. I could argue, I could refuse, but it wouldn't change anything. So I did the chores. Lately, she had been dropping hints. When you have a baby, leave the housework to me, she would say with a knowing smile, making it clear that what she really wanted was a grandchild. Arlo is her only son, and that makes me the sole focus of her expectations. I heard my friend's daughter-in-law got pregnant on her honeymoon, she bragged one day, and another friend's daughter-in-law has 3 kids already. I'm so jealous. I wanted a baby too, not just to appease her, but because I wanted to build my own family. Yet, despite everything, tracking cycles, supplements, even visiting a fertility shrine, I still wasn't pregnant. When I finally finished the chores, I sighed. I'm going to rest now. But before I could even sit down, she smiled. Thank you for your hard work, but it's almost lunchtime. Pasta is fine for me. By the time I crawled into bed, it was noon. Later, I brought up fertility treatment with Arlo. The doctor wants us to go together to plan the next steps. Can you free up your Saturday morning? Arlo frowned. What? I've never heard of that before. You told me to go to the hospital because you were worried about us not having kids. I reminded him. I did, but why do I have to go? Because fertility treatment involves both of us, I explained, trying to stay patient. The doctor said your reproductive health is just as important. They need to check your semen to rule out any issues. His expression darkened. Why don't you just go alone? That's none of my business. His words stung. It is your business. This affects both of us. Every time I see your mom, she asks why we don't have children yet. His jaw tightened. Don't talk about my mother like that. This is your fault because you're infertile. Fix it. I need your cooperation to do that. I pleaded. I don't need to be checked. I'm healthy, he snapped. We have a good marriage, and I have plenty of sperm. No need for a test. Then prove it, I said, my voice flat. Arlo scoffed. How would you like it if your colleagues saw you in a place like that? Are you trying to humiliate me? I'm a nurse. I see patients dealing with this every day. No one would judge you, I countered. Well, I'm not going. End of discussion. He pulled the covers over his head, shutting me out. I stared at him, my heart sinking. Was I asking too much? I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. Nurses work exhausting shifts, but even hospitals understand the importance of rest. My job gave me time to recover after night shifts. But at home, there was no such thing. I never truly had a day off. If I had known this was what married life would be like, I never would have changed jobs. Lately, my mother-in-law's criticisms had become relentless. It was hard to believe, considering how indifferent she had been at the start of my marriage. Back then, she never pressured me or expected me to handle the housework alone. But something had changed. Maybe it was because I wasn't getting pregnant. When Arlo and I first married, I was healthy, curvy even, but over time, I withered away, growing thinner and more exhausted with each passing day. I looked sickly, but somehow, neither my husband nor my mother-in-law seemed to notice. Maybe, because they saw me every day, the gradual change was invisible to them. Then, one summer day, Arlo approached me with an idea. We're throwing a party for Mom's 60th birthday this Sunday, he said, his voice light with excitement. She's inviting a lot of friends, so I need you to take care of the preparations. He handed me a piece of paper filled with neatly written notes in Tiana's handwriting. A list of guests, their contact information, a detailed menu, down to the specific brand of liquor and the order in which the dishes should be served. I blinked at the sheer amount of planning that had already been done. 10 guests, I murmured, and this much food? But, Arlo, that's right after my late shift. My mother said Sunday works best for her, he replied nonchalantly. You'll be fine, you're usually up by noon anyway, and that's when the party starts. With that, he left the room, as if the matter was settled. I already knew neither of them would lift a finger to help me. The morning of the party, I came home from my shift feeling drained, but there was no time to rest. I had already done the laundry and cleaning the night before, but thanks to my husband, I had to run out and buy more groceries. He had eaten some of the food I'd prepared in advance. By the time I returned, guests had already begun arriving. My mother-in-law, dressed elegantly, flitted around the room, offering warm welcomes and showing them around. Meanwhile, I rushed to prepare drinks, set the table, and finish cooking the main course. I was already behind schedule, but I pushed myself to catch up. Then, just as I was plating the final dish, Arlo barged into the kitchen. "What are you doing, Helen? You're late," he snapped, irritation clear in his voice. I didn't have to ask who had sent him. "You can't even prep the food right. Bring it out now, you're making Mom mad," he swore under his breath before grabbing an extra bottle of wine and storming back out. At that moment, a stack of plates teetered precariously before crashing to the floor, shattering into dozens of pieces. My stomach clenched. They were my mother-in-law's favorites. Arlo turned, glanced at the mess, and shrugged. "That's your fault. You shouldn't have stacked them like that." Then, without another word, he left the kitchen. Of course, he didn't help. I crouched down, carefully picking up the broken shards, my hands trembling with exhaustion. I hated this. "Why am I always the one doing everything?" I muttered under my breath. A warm voice cut through the silence. "What's wrong?" Startled, I turned. Standing in the doorway was Douglas, my father-in-law, holding a large package. He must have heard the crash. "Are you hurt?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. Something inside me cracked. It had been so long since anyone in this house had asked me that. I suddenly realized I hadn't seen Douglas since New Year's. He stepped closer, scanning the room. His eyes flicked over the dishes, the food, the mess. "Did you do all of this by yourself?" he asked, his gaze searching for any sign of help. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I always do," I replied, my voice hollow. Douglas fell silent, his eyes locking onto mine. For the first time, he seemed to truly see me, the dark circles under my eyes, my dull, thinning hair, the way my clothes hung loosely on my frail frame. His expression shifted. Slowly, his shock gave way to anger. "I'm going to talk to my wife. You're coming with me," he said, his voice low and firm. "I still have dishes to wash," I whispered weakly. "You don't have to," Douglas said, his tone final. I hesitated, but he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and led me out of the kitchen. In the living room, Tiana sat among her guests, laughing as she poured herself a glass of wine. Arlo lounged beside her, unconcerned. "Hey, Helen, how much longer are you going to make me wait?" My mother-in-law snapped the moment she saw me. Then, noticing Douglas, her expression softened. "Oh, there you are," she said sweetly. "Everyone, this is my husband. He's been working out of town and came home just for me." She beamed as she introduced him to her friends, completely oblivious to the storm brewing behind his eyes. When my mother-in-law introduced Douglas, the guests greeted him with polite nods and smiles. My father-in-law smiled back, but there was an unmistakable edge to his demeanor. "Thank you all for being here today," Douglas said, his voice deep but calm. "I'm Douglas, her husband." He paused, then added with a slight smirk, "My foolish wife is grateful for your hospitality." "Oh my God," Tiana laughed nervously. "You called me a foolish wife? It's my birthday." "You are foolish, truly," my father-in-law replied, his tone surprisingly blunt. "What?" Tiana exclaimed, her face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. That one word, foolish, shattered the warm atmosphere, leaving a thick, uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Douglas motioned for me to stand beside him, even though I instinctively wanted to hide behind him. Out of view, facing the guests, he continued, his voice measured but heavy with meaning. "I would like to introduce you to my son's wife, Helen." "Hey, honey, Helen is busy preparing," my mother-in-law began to explain, but Douglas cut her off with a fierce glare, silencing her immediately. "A year and a half ago, she married my son. She was a cheerful, smiling young lady, and I believed, no, I knew, she and my son had a bright future. But look at her now. He paused, scanning the room for reactions. She didn't look this miserable 6 months ago, he concluded, his voice thick with emotion. Guests began murmuring among themselves. She doesn't look anything like her photos. She's way too skinny. Douglas turned to face Tiana. What happened? Why has she changed so much? Tiana hesitated, her eyes darting between the guests and Douglas, before speaking carefully. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, she changed hospitals and started working night shifts earlier this year. Douglas frowned deeply. Okay. So, are all of Helen's colleagues going through this as well? Because if they are, that sounds like a serious violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I may need to contact the union. Tiana stammered, trying to correct him, but her words faltered. Douglas wasn't done. Are you still pretending you know nothing about this? I've heard the truth. Helen has been working late-night shifts, then expected to come home and cook all of this by herself, with no rest at all. His voice was now hard, angry. That was the truth. I had told Douglas everything, the emotional and physical toll I'd been enduring for the last 6 months. Tiana looked away, unable to argue further. Douglas's gaze shifted to Arlo. And you, Arlo? You knew Helen was going through all this, so why haven't you stepped in to help? Arlo's reply was defensive. It's between Helen and Mom. It's got nothing to do with me. Douglas's voice rose, the anger palpable. What did you vow at your wedding? Didn't you swear to protect her, to support her, to make her happy? Does she look happy to you? Arlo stuttered, flustered. Well, of course, I thought it was a bit much sometimes, but Mom said it was normal for a woman without kids to do all this. Douglas shook his head in disbelief. You're supposed to put your wife before your mother. Have you already forgotten how your first marriage ended? Because you pushed her just like this? Arlo's face flushed a deep red. I stared at him, stunned. I had known Arlo had been married before, but I hadn't realized how badly his ex-wife had been treated, just like I was now. It all made sense. Tiana suddenly snapped. Let me tell you something. This is the kind of work she should be doing as a woman without children. It's been a year since they got married, and she still can't have a baby. She's an unfit wife. Douglas's expression turned icy. Even if she were infertile, it's not her fault. You're just taking your frustration out on her. Tiana's eyes widened, and she exploded. What? How dare you? You've been gone for so long. What do you know about it? You don't understand anything. Everyone brags about their grandchildren, and I'm the only one without any. Tiana cried out, her voice rising in desperation. I'm lonely. I want a grandchild as soon as possible. As she shouted, the tears came. A part of me felt a pang of sympathy for her, but that didn't change the years of mental and physical strain she had caused me. I looked her in the eye, my voice steady. I don't think you'll be getting any grandchildren for a long time. I held up a few pieces of paper I'd taken from my room. These are the results from my fertility clinic tests, blood tests, AMH levels, uterine and fallopian tube drainage tests, anti-sperm antibody tests. All of them are fine. My body is perfectly normal. I turned to face Arlo. If your ex-wife had similar test results, don't you think you know what the issue is? I asked coldly. The problem is you, Arlo. I stared at him, refusing to look away. Arlo stammered, a look of confusion and fear creeping onto his face. You had a hunch, didn't you? That's why you never wanted to get tested. And yet, instead of standing by me, you treated me like your personal housekeeper, just like your mother did. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I loved you once. I tried to keep the test results to myself, but you yelled at me again, and still wouldn't help. I know now that you did the same things to your ex-wife. I shook my head. I just don't care anymore. Wait a minute. Arlo pleaded. It's not true. I can't be infertile, right? I looked at him one last time, my heart numb. Well, why don't you get a proper examination? I said, my voice low but firm. But honestly, it doesn't matter to me anymore. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving my husband's desperate pleas and my sobbing mother-in-law behind. As I stepped into the hall, I heard the faint sound of guests leaving. Aftermath. Later, Arlo and I finalized our divorce through an attorney. He fought hard, but with Douglas's recording of the conversation, it was clear I had been emotionally abused by both him and Tiana for months. Arlo eventually had a sperm analysis done, and the result, oligospermia. My mother-in-law was furious with him. After the divorce, I thought Arlo and Tiana might change, but they didn't. That's when Douglas stepped in, making sure I wasn't alone. He later apologized for not recognizing the situation sooner and for not urging Arlo to get tested before we married. Rumor has it that Tiana, after being kicked out, now lives with Arlo in public housing in the same city. Her former friends have all cut ties with her. Word of the incident spread, and Arlo now faces shame at work. Douglas later introduced me to someone new. After 6 months of dating, I remarried. He's everything I wanted in a partner: kind, dependable, and strong. He works under Douglas, and we're building a life together. Recently, I had an appointment with my obstetrician, and found out I'm 2 months pregnant. I plan to visit Douglas soon to share the news. After all, it was his support and kindness that helped me escape that toxic environment.